Chapter 085 Critical Mass. Zorian would be lying if he said that interacting with Quetzalcoatl again didn't fill him with dread. Aside from the fact that the ancient lich had reached an unfathomable level of expertise in soul magic and could possibly detect residual damage on their souls, their current trade offer was fundamentally different from what they did during their last interaction with him. Before, it was Quetzalcoatl who approached them. Last time, he had blindsided them with his sudden visit. He had the initiative right from the start, which doubtlessly helped lessen the level of threat he felt from them. This time, it would be them who were going to blindside him. And Zorian was not at all sure the ancient lich could take that gracefully. Yet, Zorian knew he had to risk it. The fact was, their current initiatives were insufficient. Even if they managed to gather all the keys together in one restart before the time ran out, that wouldn't be enough. Not for Zorian, anyway. The problem of how he was supposed to exit the time loop still remained. His original self was still out there in the real world, so he couldn't just order the Guardian of the Threshold to shove his soul into his real body and be done with it. The Guardian of the Threshold may be confused about his controller's status, but it would surely notice there was already a soul in Zorian's original body upon trying that. And even if that could be sidestepped somehow, there was still the matter of how to seize control of the body from his original self. Zorian had a couple of ideas on how he could leave the time loop despite this issue, but all of them required incredibly advanced knowledge of dimensionalism and soul magic to accomplish. Quetzalcoatl had both, and it was likely that the insights he had into those two fields were impossible to find elsewhere. Zorian couldn't afford to ignore this priceless source of information, no matter how dangerous it was. Arranging a meeting with the ancient lich proved to be rather simple, at least. All they had to do was go to the same corner store that Quetzalcoatl had sent them to the last time they had interacted with him and ask about him. The man behind the counter acted as if they were crazy, but not long after they left, the cephalic rats suddenly became a lot more interested in them and started following them around. Zorian simply kept stealing away the individual rats from the collective for a few days before Quetzalcoatl decided to contact them personally and arrange for a meeting. At the moment, Zorian and Quetzalcoatl were sitting in the private booth of a relatively high-class restaurant near the city center. Not exactly the type of institution Zorian liked to frequent, in part because just getting a seat in one of those was pretty hard for an unknown teenager like him. But Quetzalcoatl had been the one to pick the location, and he was evidently in the mood to show off his wealth and influence. He was using the same face and flesh and blood look he did the last time they met in a public location. Either this appearance was his usual persona for dealing with people, or this was how he once looked before discarding his flesh for an undead existence. "What an interesting offer," Quetzalcoatl said, playing around with his fork thoughtfully, occasionally tapping it against his glass. He had ordered an expensive meal and wine for the occasion, but did not touch any of it throughout the entire meeting. "I'm no stranger to people seeking me out for my wealth of magical secrets, but usually their offers are hesitant. They are leery of angering a powerful lich, they aren't sure if I am really as good as they heard, and they're trying to pay as little as possible to get what they want. They start small, asking for relatively minor things in order to puzzle out how I think and what it would take to get what they really want." The ancient lich then made a dramatic pause, pointing at the small pile of divine artifacts and rare materials that Zack and Zorian brought to him as payment for his wealth of magical secrets, as he put it. "You though?" Quetzalcoatl continued. "You're immediately going for the kill. You want nothing less than my complete pocket dimension creation expertise, an extremely rare, almost priceless set of secrets, and you're willing to offer no less than 5 divine artifacts and a plethora of extremely rare materials in return. I'm impressed by your boldness, but I can't help but wonder. Are you not worried I will cheat you, or that this will end up a disappointing trade in the end? You are, after all, trading physical goods for information of uncertain value. I could easily just ignore you after pocketing the goods, or play dumb and give you mere shadow of what you asked for." Zorian mentally agreed with this, but wasn't really worried. Although many things about the ancient lich were enigmatic, he was pretty sure he had a good read on his sense of honor. Quetzalcoatl prided himself on his sense of fairness. He would not cheat them unless he thought they were trying to cheat him first. The real challenge was to make him agree to the deal in the first place. Although I don't dare claim I know you, you are as famed for your honorable behavior as you are for your great magical skill and brutality in warfare, Zorian said. Kotachichel smiled idly, clearly viewing all three traits as a compliment. We feel that if we can reach an agreement with you, you will do your best to honor it. Perhaps my knowledge of pocket dimensions isn't as extensive as you think it is, though, Kotachichel pointed out. I am indeed a man of many talents, but that is quite a rare and exotic field of study. You may end up disappointed by the results of the trade. If so, we will accept it quietly and in good grace, Zorian shrugged. We're willing to take a gamble. Although it is not a smart thing to admit such a thing in these kinds of negotiations, I feel you are being a little too reckless here, Kotachichel noted thoughtfully, giving them both a piercing look, as if trying to see through their souls. It would have been smarter to try and do a smaller trade at first just to see if my pocket dimension skills are worth the more substantial investment. Well, said Zack with a cheeky smile. Although this is generally not a smart thing to admit in these kinds of negotiations, the fact is we're in a bit of a hurry. Slowly feeling you out and haggling over the details would take too long. That's why the terms we offered you were so generous, see? Generous? Debatable, Kotachichel scoffed. I was merely questioning your logic just now. I said nothing about how good the deal appears to me. What you are seeking is pretty damn valuable. Yes, but so is our payment, Zack immediately shot back. We realize that reaching out to you so suddenly and asking for such a heavy favor is a bit unreasonable. We also realize that, being in a bit of a hurry, we are innately in a disadvantaged position compared to you. We're on a time limit, you aren't. That's why we're willing to offer as much as we did, though, in normal circumstances, we would never consider this a reasonable trade. Kotachichel stared at them for a few seconds. Perhaps he was trying to put pressure on them through silence to see how they would react. You're pretty interesting people, Kotachichel said. I think that's why I haven't simply told you to screw off by now. That's what I'd normally tell people if they tried to give me this kind of deal. Are you really teenagers? You are way too calm for people that are supposed to be, 15 years old. Why bother even asking? Zack challenged. We already know you've tried to spy on us before inviting us here, so you probably know enough about us to answer this yourself. I do know some basic facts about you too, Kotachichel admitted. It's just that they don't make much sense. How the hell did 2 academy students gather all this and find out how to contact me? Who are you really? It's a secret, Zorian said blandly. There was no point in trying to explain. But since we're asking private questions about one another, let me ask you a question of my own. How exactly did you talk no less than 4 cephalic rot swarms into working under you? What the hell did you offer them to make them open to cooperation? I can't even get them to talk to me, much less work for me. Heh? Are we including that information as part of our deal? Kotachichel asked with a grin. No, Zorian snorted derisively. I was just curious. And also changing the subject, Kotachichel noted. But fine, I get it. If you want to keep your true identity secret, I won't pry. But you know, if you really are as young as you appear, then we have another problem on our hands. Namely, I'm not sure if you're even capable of learning how to perform dimensional magic on the level you were asking about. What makes you think you are qualified to learn from me? That is not an issue, Zorian insisted. We know we can perform this level of magic because we are already capable of creating pocket dimensions. Oh, Kotachichel said, a little incredulously. Yes, Zorian confirmed. They would have to be careful not to make themselves look too amazing, or else Kotachichel might notice something was wrong and attack them again. But this particular bit of information was impossible to hide, considering what they were asking of him. We are asking you for advanced guidance, not asking you to teach us the basics of the field. Zorian then removed a bracelet from his wrist and handed it to the ancient lich, who gracelessly snatched it out of his outstretched hand and began to scrutinize it. The bracelet was something Zorian had personally created before coming here. It served as an anchor for a miniature pocket dimension. The internal space was tiny, barely enough to store a book or two, but that wasn't important. The important thing was that it proved that not only were they capable of creating pocket dimensions, they could create advanced ones. Most products of pocket dimension magic came in the form of boxes, chests and other rigid containers that had their internal volume expanded beyond what their outside form would suggest. These kinds of objects were relatively easy to make, as anchoring a pocket dimension to an internal space of a hollow, inflexible object was a relatively simple task. Well, as much as any pocket dimension creation could ever be easy, anyway. A more advanced procedure was to use dimensional magic to expand the interior of more flexible containers like bags, backpacks and pockets. Although this sounded rather convenient, fabric was relatively fragile and hard to imbue with spell formula. After a few years of use at most, such objects inevitably fell apart, sometimes causing catastrophic failures when least expected. Finally, there were objects like the palace orb and the bracelet that Kotachichul was currently holding. These objects were not containers with expanded interior at all. They were self-contained pockets worlds anchored to an object. Accessing the contents of such a self-contained space was tricky without dimensional magic, which drastically reduced the amount of people that could use them, but they were incredibly stable. They could be inflated to downright ridiculous sizes, if one had a sufficiently stable anchor object. As the palace orb amply proved. The bracelet Zorian cobbled up in the last few days was pretty underwhelming in that regard, but he was sure that Kotachichul would recognize what it signified nevertheless. After a minute or so of silent study, Kotachichul handed the bracelet back to Zorian and then unceremoniously drew all the divine artifacts and exotic materials towards him with a sweep of his hand. After a few quick movements, they all disappeared into his pockets. Neither Zack nor Zorian moved to stop him. "All right," Kotachichul said with a small nod. "You win. I accept the deal. Since you have said you were in a hurry and I'm going to be busy with something soon, we can start tomorrow." Busy with something. What a funny way to hide the fact he was planning an invasion of the city and the release of the primordial trapped in the hole. Still, Zack and Zorian were pretending not to know about that in this restart, so they said nothing about that. After arranging for their next meeting place and hammering out some minor details, they turned to leave only for the Lich to stop them. "One more thing," Kotachichul said. "Who messed up your soul so badly?" Zorian couldn't help but jolt a little at the question. What?" he asked. "Your souls are scarred," Kotachichul said matter-of-factly. "The damage is faint now, and will probably go away completely in a few years, but less than a year ago you must have been in an absolutely miserable condition. A normal person would take years recovering from something like that. Much of it would be spent comatose, too. I guess I should add soul magic to the list of things you are inexplicably proficient in? Damn it." So he could detect it. Though it didn't look like he recognized it as something inflicted by him in particular. "Does it matter?" Zack challenged. "No, I guess not," Kotachichul said, frowning. "But it makes me even more certain you are not really who you present yourself as. You are fortunate I have something else occupying my attention at the moment, or else I would not be as willing to let this go so easily. Make no mistake, though, once I've cleared up my schedule a little, I'll come back to visit you so we can clear some things up." Zorian did not outwardly react to this proclamation, but inwardly he was breathing a sigh of relief. No doubt Kotachichul meant this as a veiled threat, but so long as nothing happened within the bounds of the time loop, Zorian didn't really care about that. Provided they didn't mess up in some other way as the restart developed, they should be fine. Hopefully Silver Lake would take his warnings not to investigate into Kotachichul more seriously this time around. Break, whether because Kotachichul didn't know that they were aware of the invasion this time around, or because he never discovered just how expansive their activities around the region really were, the Lich didn't seem to view them as very threatening this time around. They were kind of baffling, yes, but he had an invasion to organize and he had no idea he had a time limit when it came to figuring them out. In regards to his obligations, he fulfilled them to the letter. The agreement called for him to provide them with instructions for 2 hours every day, and he was never late for the arranged time, nor did he stay so much as 1 minute longer than they agreed. If he withheld some of his expertise, it was in a way that neither Zack nor Zorian could tell the difference. The amount of information he had for them was enough to keep them busy for quite a while. He spoke clearly and understandably. He readily clarified his statements if he saw they did not understand him. He pointed out any obvious mistakes they did under his supervision and explained the logic behind his instructions rather than let them figure things out for themselves. He never lost patience with them or insulted them. He was, strangely enough, probably the best teacher Zorian had ever encountered. Realizing that a soul-defiling, warmongering, thousand-year-old lich was his ideal academic instructor was a somewhat unnerving realization for Zorian. That aside, having Quatachichel's dedicated help in understanding pocket dimension magic made Zorian suddenly aware that it wasn't just the lack of qualified teachers and instruction manuals that was holding him and Zack back from advancing quickly in the field. Embarrassingly enough, it often happened that Quatachichel was pushing ahead in his lessons and the two of them struggled to follow along. To put it bluntly, the real bottleneck to making the most out of those lessons was their own lack of talent and comprehension, not Quatachichel's unwillingness to instruct them to the best of his ability. Zorian had a feeling the ancient lich was laughing at them on the inside about that. Zorian knew this kind of result was to be expected. It wasn't that Zack and Zorian were stupid, or that their work ethic was lacking. It was just that they lacked any special advantage when it came to learning something like pocket dimension magic. They had no special talent or bloodline related to the field, and neither of them was the kind of genius that could easily grasp the complexities of this relatively mind-bending, intuitive field of study. There was little that could be done to speed their learning process up, at least through traditional methods of advancement. So Zorian turned to non-traditional methods instead. For a while now he had been hesitating about delving deeper into the field of mental enhancements he had been messing with, afraid that he would permanently mess up his own mind in the process. Now he decided to risk it and ordered his simulacrums to kick things up a few levels. Aware that time was steadily running out, they did not complain much and simply jumped at the task with enthusiasm that honestly surprised him. He supposed that since he himself had set aside his fears and resolved to tackle the issue, they inherited his determination as well. Unlike in the past, where he himself had viewed the endeavor with apprehension, and thus his simulacrums had been similarly unenthused about risking themselves. For the moment, his idea was to try and create a sort of mental calculator and internal clock, since a lot of the problems with pocket dimensions came from the inhuman timing and precision required to pull off certain stages successfully. Normally this was achieved via a complex system of divination magic, which added an extra layer of complexity to an already tricky task. If he could strip away the divination scaffolding and just do all the number crunching, measurements and timing decisions purely in his head, the magic would get significantly easier. Of course, it turned out to be not that easy. While Zorian knew that creating a mental calculator was very much possible, since it was one of the more common modifications Arania tinkered with, it was a tricky thing to pull off in practice. Several of his simulacrum had to be forcibly broken out of their experiments after they fell into strange mental states, endlessly counting the number of pebbles around them and such. Thankfully, none of them were so far gone that they had to be destroyed and recreated, so they were able to learn from their mistakes instead of starting from scratch and trying to guess where their predecessors made a mistake. Additionally, he was also experimenting with hyper-focus mental states and with trying to replicate the Hydra's unity of self with his simulacrums. He had a feeling that if he could synchronize himself with a handful of his own simulacrums the way a Hydra could synchronize its multiple minds into oneself, many complex pieces of magic would become relatively trivial to perform. Of course, these kind of mental enhancement were only of possible benefit to Zorian, and did not help Zack in any way. For this reason, and also because he wanted to hedge his bets, Zorian also started to look more closely into blood magic and enhancement rituals. After all, some creatures were innately good at dimensionalism in various forms. Phase spiders, for instance, were capable of instinctively creating small pocket dimensions to hide themselves in. Blink toads could teleport short distances, Void Soldier could bend space around them to make spells and projectiles launched at them miss, and the silver-striped mole was rumored to be able to perceive dimensional cracks and boundaries in some strange fashion. It might be worthwhile to try and steal those kinds of abilities for a while, just to see if they could offer them with some kind of important insight or capability. Of course, Zorian was currently not very well versed in either blood magic or regular enhancement rituals, so he would first have to practice with something relatively simple and then slowly work his way up to what he wanted. Alternatively, he could just hire an alchemist to make him an enhancement potion with desired ability, but such enhancement potions did not confer the sort of instinctive competence with the gained ability that a properly executed enhancement ritual did. In any case, both the mental enhancement route and the blood magic route were long projects. It would be at least a couple of restarts before he could make an effective use of them, maybe more. Thus, Zorian ended up turning to something more immediate to get the most out of Quetzalcoatl's teachings, his spell formula expertise. Zorian knew for a while now that most old, experienced diviners had specialized divination compasses they used to perform their work. Zorian himself rarely bothered with them, preferring to simply dump information straight into his mind and sort it out mentally, but he had tinkered with such devices often enough in the past. Kerma's divination flower thingy and the spell formula crafters she referred him to were especially useful in this regard. Now he embarked on a project to create such a divination compass, one specialized in figuring out divination related to dimensionalism and pocket dimension creation. In this, at least, he had plenty of success. Spell formula were one of the things he had focused on pretty heavily throughout his entire time in the time loop, and he had reached an extremely high level of skill when it came to them. Producing a working version of such a dimensionalism-specific divination compass took only 2 days, after which he rapidly improved the design, producing newer and more potent versions every couple of days. By the time the end of the restart was approaching, these divination compasses had become so good that Quetzalcoatl took notice of it and commissioned a couple of them for his own use. In exchange, he provided them with the names and locations of 2 secretive mages that also knew a thing or two about pocket dimension magic, information that was almost as priceless as Quetzalcoatl's own lessons, as far as Zack and Zorian were concerned. Gradually, the end of the restart started to approach. Break, while trying to deepen their understanding of pocket dimension magic, consumed most of their energies in this particular restart. It was far from being the only thing they worked on. An equally critical, though far more boring task was to make sure the Pearl of Arenhal reached Blantyre safe and intact. A mission that was thankfully far easier than they had ever hoped it would be. No sea monsters bothered them, and while no less than 3 dragons spotted them as they flew near the Dragon Island, they were surprisingly easy to keep at bay with flashy combat spells and a single experimental, magic-enhanced cannon that Zorian had installed on the ship. Neither the spells nor the cannon actually did any damage to the dragons in question, but they kept the beasts from simply rushing at them and ripping the hull into shreds. Perhaps because they had never seen an airship like theirs and did not know what combat abilities to expect from it, all 3 of the dragons limited themselves to probing attacks and flying in circles around them for a few hours to see if their response times and attentiveness would ever slip up. It helped that each of the dragons attacked alone. Only after one of the dragons had given up on bothering them would the next one try his luck. If all 3 of them had united against them, Pearl of Arenhal would have been doomed without question. Thankfully for them, dragons were notoriously solitary creatures that viewed their own kind largely as competition rather than kin. They lived and hunted alone, only forming societies if pressured to do so by outside aggression. Zorian had heard there had been a few ill-considered campaigns in the past that sought to systematically wipe out dragons in a particular area, only for the dragons in question to temporarily amass themselves into massive flocks that devastated everything around them for a while before eventually breaking up again when they were certain the danger was gone. Aside from that, dragons were largely an individual threat, and dragons of Dragon Island were no exception. Unfortunately, While their journey had not been delayed by dragons and sea monsters, their own lack of navigational skill had lengthened the journey somewhat. Additionally, while the people who made Pearl of Aranhal were world-class experts, it was still a prototype that had never really been tested or truly finished before being sent on such an ambitious journey. Meaning that it had almost broken down several times along the way, almost crashing them into the sea at one point and forcing them to drastically slow down at several points along their chosen route. But in the end they made it. 5 days before the restart was about to end, the Pearl of Aranhal finally spotted the shores of Blantyre. 5 days was not enough to really do anything, though. If they had to go through this kind of lengthy, annoying journey in every single restart, only to be left with measly 5 days per restart to locate the Imperial staff, they were guaranteed to fail. Thus, their first and very urgent priority was to locate the Bakura Gate somewhere on the continent. Any Bakura Gate, really. That way they could reach the continent in only a handful of days with the help of silent doorway adepts and subsequent restarts. Sadly, this was not an easy task. Bakura gates were scattered all over Blantyre, but the continent was vast and the gates were small. Searching for them blindly would take forever, which meant they had no choice but to seek the natives for help in finding them. The trouble was, Blantyre was not inhabited by humans. The steaming equatorial jungle that covered Blantyre was home to a multitude of sapient species, but the most advanced and powerful force were the lizardmen. They lived in great stone cities along the coast and the rivers, and although they were very awfully primitive by human standards, they were more or less the only ones qualified to help Zack and Zorian locate the Bakura Gate somewhere around here. Not only were they the only species on Blantyre that kept any sort of written records, they also regularly traded with humans from Xlotic and Altasia, which meant that some of them actually spoke a language that Zack and Zorian could understand. Unfortunately, while the lizardmen did occasionally trade with humans, getting the location of a nearby Bakura Gate out of them was still a huge chore. For one thing, they existed as a collection of small kingdoms and quarreling city-states that rarely shared information with one another, so unless a Bakura Gate was literally in their territory there was no chance they would know about such a strange but ultimately useless artifact. For another, only the priesthood was literate and knowledgeable of obscure places and artifacts like these, and they were not terribly fond of outsiders. Finally, while the lizardmen did occasionally trade with humans, they did so with great caution and only in a strictly regulated manner. If they wanted information, they couldn't just walk into a lizardman city and start asking questions. They had to go through official channels and make a formal request. Pressed for time as they were, Zack and Zorian resorted to shock and awe to get what they want. Rather than carefully approaching the local rulers and making respectful diplomatic requests for information about Bakura Gates, they brazenly flew Pearl of Aranhal straight above the nearest lizardman city, teleported themselves into the city center and then started throwing around gold, gems and some spices that they heard lizardmen liked at everyone in the vicinity until someone came to talk to them, at which point they promised great rewards for any information about the Bakura Gates. Then they moved on and repeated this process in every larger city they encountered as they flew around the coast. The reaction was everything they hoped it would be. The lizardmen may be primitive, but they had their ways, and news of their airship and what they were seeking quickly spread to every lizardman power in the vicinity. Soon, everyone knew that two immensely powerful human mages were flying around in their fancy airship and promising fantastic rewards to anyone who could lead them to a Bakura Gate. Admittedly, this did cause a lot of the lizardmen to come forward with fabricated tales of nearby Bakura Gates, but those were easily seen through by Zorian. Lizardman emotions were not alien enough to give Zorian's empathy too much trouble. Eventually, 3 days later, they were summoned by one of the local kings from a river city-state deeper in the continent's interior. The emissary brought with him a very lifelike drawing of a Bakura Gate as proof that they were telling the truth, which was good enough for Zack and Zorian to immediately set out towards the place. This was why, at the moment, the two of them were standing in a luxurious stone throne room of a lizardman king, curiously observing their surroundings while they waited for the king to actually arrive and talk to them. Lizardman rulers seemed to be fond of mosaics made out of gems and colored stones, And this one was not an exception. The walls were dominated by some kind of epic battle scene between two lizardman forces. One of the two sides, which Zorian presumed to represent the forces of the city they were currently in, was clearly dominating their opponents, boldly advancing forward, while the other was in the process of being pierced by spears, clubbed over the head by heavy clubs, or down on their knees and begging for mercy. An absolutely giant lizardman floated in the sky above the scene, curiously observing the battle. Probably a representation of one of the lizardman gods. Zorian's idle musings were interrupted by the loud entrance of the lizardman king. A procession of musicians playing some kind of annoying flute-like instruments came first, playing ear-splitting whistles, while a bunch of lizardman children ran around and threw petals on the ground in front of the approaching king. The lizardman throne guards, which had been leaning on their spears and chatting amongst themselves in their incomprehensible lizardman tongue, quickly assumed a proper posture and pretended they had been alert and battle-ready all this time. They also banged their spears against the floor a few times and let loose a keening wail that was probably some kind of salute. As for Zack and Zorian, they just stared at the spectacle, not sure how to react. Perhaps because they had arrived so unexpectedly, or because those rulers had not been so wealthy and powerful as this one, but this was not the way the other lizardman kings had behaved in front of them. What's the proper procedure for greeting a lizardman ruler again? Are we supposed to bow or shake hands or something? Zack whispered to him uncertainly. Why are you asking me? Zorian protested. Your nobility, not me. You should be the one who knows things like this. Please, Zack scoffed. You're the one who is constantly interacting with various talking monsters. This is totally your area of expertise. Zorian turned his attention to the approaching king. He was surprisingly short compared to the warriors scattered around his palace, though the massive gem-encrusted headdress and glittering golden jewelry hanging off of him immediately marked him as the ruler regardless. In one of his hands he carried a black staff with a large, glowing, amber stone affixed on top. 4 particularly massive lizardman warriors flanked him on both sides, which made for a somewhat amusing contrast between them and their king. What was not so amusing was the look in their eyes and the emotions they were radiating. Unlike the normal palace guards, these 4 took their jobs very seriously, and their yellow, slitted eyes followed them with a threatening intensity. If they made so much as a threatening movement, they were ready to shove a spear through their throat without warning. Also accompanying the king was another lizardman with lots of jewelry and an elaborate headdress, although one less impressive and of slightly different type and color scheme. Zorian suspected that he was pretty sure it was a female lizardman, was the high priest of the city. And though she wasn't as overtly hostile as the king's honor guard, she clearly did not like them at all. Zorian inwardly sighed. Of course nothing could ever be easy. Break. Zack and Zorian had already managed to claim the imperial ring from the Ziggurat of the Sun in the past. Since they now knew that it was held by the Solrotham High Priest, getting it was slightly easier than it had previously been, when they had yet to even locate where it was. However, easier didn't mean easy. The Solrotham High Priest resided in the innermost, most heavily defended portion of the Ziggurat. Getting to him still required a large-scale assault on the Solrotham settlement, which was non-ideal. Rather than organize another assault on the Ziggurat of the Sun in this restart, Zorian agreed to try something different this time around. After establishing a base near the Ziggurat using Bakura gates, they brought over a dozen or so Iranian mercenaries and instructed them to spy on Solrotham guards and patrols. Although Solrotham mines were as alien to the Arania as they were to Zorian, the Arania were far more experienced with making sense of alien mines than he was. They did it all their lives, after all. At the same time they began ambushing and killing Solrotham hunting parties and patrol groups leaving the Ziggurat, in the hopes that doing this continually would eventually force the High Priest to confront them directly, or at least motivate the Solrotham to try and negotiate with them. After all, the colony would surely starve if they couldn't send anyone outside without them disappearing, right? Unfortunately, the Solrotham didn't behave like they hoped they would. Rather than investigate the problem, they simply barricaded themselves inside and no longer tried to leave the Ziggurat. It was baffling. Either the colony had sizable stockpiles of preserved food and felt certain they could last for a while under siege, or there was a dungeon entrance somewhere below the ziggurat and they decided to brave the tunnels to feed themselves instead. Either way, it was annoying. Thankfully, the Arania were somewhat successful in their information gathering. So, Zorian asked the Arania in front of him. I don't think the damn wasps are going to poke their heads out of their turtle shells anytime soon. Do you have something useful to report? I think so, yeah, Storm Dream, the Arania in question, answering him through a voice spell so Zack could hear her too. First of all, the ring you're after? It's not an accident that the High Priest has it on him. He knows what it does and is actively using it. Oh. Now that I think about it, that does make sense, Zorian mused. I could tell the last time we met that he is a soul mage. That was a bit unusual, since Solrotham aren't exactly known for their magic abilities, but I thought nothing of it at the time. Since he's wearing a ring that grants soul sight, though, I guess it's to be expected he became interested in that type of magic. We're fortunate he didn't populate the ziggurat with undead guards or something. Probably wouldn't happen, even if he knew how to do that, Storm Dream said. They are very religious and they seem to attach great importance to being cremated upon death. Some nonsense about returning to the Sun Mother and whatnot. Well, they should be happy about all those patrols we fireballed to death recently, then, Zack said cheekily. They got a proper burial as they died. Yes. Well, Storm Dream said after a second of awkward silence. If you want to lure the High Priest out of the ziggurat, I have only two ideas. One is to wait for him to come outside on his own to perform one of his periodic land blessings and reading of the signs. The next such occasion should be about 2 months from now and, too long, Zack immediately said, shaking his head. I don't understand why you're in such a hurry about this. The ring has been in the High Priest's hands for years now. It's not going anywhere, Storm Dream said, with no small amount of exasperation. But fine. The other option is to try and ally yourself with the nearby Solrotham tribe that this particular bunch has a rivalry with. I'm not entirely sure, but I think he would come out of the ziggurat and support his warriors if he thought it was a rival tribe attacking them instead of scary human mages with their unfair, mysterious magic and thunder sticks. Ah, nodded Zorian. The thought of seeing if the tribe had any local enemies and allying with them had honestly didn't even occur to him. A silly mistake, in retrospect. Zack and Zorian discussed the merits of the idea for a while, before Zorian noticed that Storm Dream was shifting in place uncomfortably and looked like she wanted to say something more. What? He asked her. It's probably just a stupid coincidence, but the Solrotham High Priest has the same kind of knife you do, she said. My knife? Zorian asked incredulously. Since when did he even carry a Neo? Oh. You mean this? He tapped the knife hanging from his backpack. It was the divine artifact they had recovered from the palace orb, the one they had no idea what it did. Zorian sometimes liked to inspect it, staring at it while futilely hoping he would finally succeed in unlocking its mysteries. Yes, like that one, Storm Dream said. I know you humans churn out thousands of identical objects as a matter of course, but I thought it was strange that a Solrotham High Priest on another continent carries the same kind of knife like you do. Especially since their one is of immense religious importance to them and has an impressive magical ability. Oh. Do tell, Zack prompted. What magical ability? The High Priest can use it to command a sandworm of immense size hidden beneath the sands of this place, Storm Dream said. It could be just more superstitious nonsense, I guess, but I don't think so. Maybe the Solrotham are overstating the worm's real size, but they seem pretty certain of its ability to repel all intruders, so it should be pretty impressive. If your knife is the same, then maybe you can control it too. Zack and Zorian were silent for a moment. I knew it was stupid, Storm Dream said. Just forget I said anything. Zorian thought about the gigantic flying sandworm they had faced in their last assault on this place. The creature was an immense threat, only kept manageable by Zack's incredible combat prowess and their extensive preparations before the battle. and the way its mind had completely stopped Zorian's mental abilities like a brick wall, unlike any other mental defense he had ever seen. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Zack asked him quietly. "I doubt our dagger can really control the Sul'Ra-Thumb sandworm," Zorian said. "But it's too bad that we already killed the giant Hydra guarding the palace orb, I'll say that much." It was just a suspicion, but Zorian felt it was likely that each knife was keyed into a different creature. Assuming that the strange flying sandworm was the divinely enhanced guardian of the Imperial Ring, it made sense that a knife that the Sul'Ra-Thumb probably found near the ring was keyed to it. By the same logic, the knife Zorian currently held in his hand was probably meant to control the Hydra instead, since it normally seemed to live in and guard the orb. "Next time, then," said Zack dreamily. "I like the idea of having my own pet Hydra, you know? We could pit it against the stupid sandworm while we tackle the Sul'Ra-Thumb ourselves. Or we could throw him at Quatachichel, just to see the look on that stupid bag of bones when a massive Hydra starts screaming and charging at him. Or just take it on a walk through Seoria like some kind of oversized dog and just soak in the people's reactions. Lots of potential there." Zorian looked at the dagger in his hand and then grasped it tightly. Next time, indeed. Break. As the end of the restart began to approach, Zack and Zorian turned their attention to something they had been gradually building up to throughout the entire restart, raiding the royal vaults for the dagger again. They sought out Quatachichel for help again, too, partially because they still hadn't grasped the details on the inner wards, so his help in getting inside was still critical, and partially because they still had designs on his crown. Zorian had to admit he was more morally conflicted about betraying Quatachichel this time around. After all, the ancient lich had been nothing but helpful throughout the entire restart. It felt wrong, dishonorable, to just stab him in the back like this in the end. Then again, didn't Quatachichel indicate during that initial negotiation they had with him that he would return to interrogate them after his little invasion business was over? Perhaps he was just looking for excuses to make himself better, but seen in that light this attack could easily be viewed as preemptive defense on their part. Plus, the lich clearly intended to invade Seoria as normal, a fact he sometimes cryptically alluded to during his lessons, but one which he never actually made clear to them. In a very real way, that was betrayal as well. He supposed in the end it didn't matter. Quatachichel once again agreed to help them steal the dagger from the Eldamar's royal vaults. They once again achieved their goal, successfully fought their way out of the capital city and then kept running from the Eldamar military until Quatachichel figured out the nature of the tracking device that was used to track them. They again opened a dimensional gate to Xlotic and stepped through it. The moment Quatachichel followed after them they shut off the gate and attacked him with no warning. There was no talking. They attacked silently and without hesitation, and Quatachichel took their ambush entirely in stride. As an endless barrage of incinerating rays, impossibly sharp dimensional blades and disintegration blasts suddenly rained down on him, he quietly blocked, dodged, teleported and retaliated in return. He did not rage at their betrayal or try to talk to them to find out their reasons. Perhaps he had been expecting it. Maybe he was just that used to sudden ambushes. Whatever the case, he silently accepted their challenge and met their attack head-on. The desert quaked. Sand was melted and turned to glass over and over. Several hidden wards and traps that Zack and Zorian prepared in the area in advance activated, only to be shattered and neutralized by Quatachichel. The ancient lich summoned a bunch of skeletal undead giants from some internal storage space on his person, and Zorian responded by throwing his combat golems at them to keep them busy. Zack managed to shear off Quatachichel's leg with one of his attacks, but the lich simply reattached it in the next moment. 3 of Zorian's simulacrums sacrificed themselves to keep him alive when facing Quatachichel's counterattacks, their inhumanly tough metallic bodies unable to withstand the ancient lich's attacks. It was then, right in the middle of the heated battle, that several hidden devices revealed themselves in the distance, blanketing the whole area with small, fast-moving silver discs. Most of the silver discs were completely mundane, meant purely to mask the real threats. Some of them were infused with specialized magic meant to stress and overload typical force shields that protected mages against physical projectiles. And finally, a small number were special. They were infused with the same sort of soul-severing magic that was once used by Kale to make the coin that ended up banishing Quetzalcoatl back to his phylactery. In order to make sure Quetzalcoatl couldn't simply push away all the discs with a simple wave of his hand, Zack and Zorian immediately intensified their attacks. Despite that, Quetzalcoatl took the little silver projectiles as a deadly threat, never letting a single one touch him, raising the ground as walls and pillars to keep them at bay when the shield disruptors started to eat away at his magical shields. But the silver discs did their job of occupying his attention anyway. So busy was he with avoiding them, dealing with Zack and Zorian's normal attacks and trying to counter attacks that he overlooked a far larger silver disc hidden in the sands nearby. This disc was also imbued with soul-severing magic, and with a much more potent form of it, too. Upon dodging one of their attacks, Quetzalcoatl ended up stepping on it and it visibly discharged a wave of white light straight into him. For a moment, the whole battlefield stilled. Quetzalcoatl was momentarily frozen in place, a look of surprise on his face. Zack and Zorian waiting with bated breaths to see if the lich would collapse into a lifeless pile of bones in the aftermath. And then the lich moved. "Yeah?" Quetzalcoatl said, speaking up for the first time since the battle had started. "You got me. But do you really think a stupid trick like that can beat me?" Well, no. He did not think that. But as a distraction, it worked better than Zorian had ever hoped it would. The moment Quetzalcoatl had finished talking, a massive wave of dispelling energy erupted out of Zack, powered by most of Zack's remaining mana. It washed away everything in the vicinity, completely catching Quetzalcoatl off guard. For just a moment, all of his defenses went down, including his mind blank. Zorian immediately reached out with his mind and began his attack. Quetzalcoatl's mental defenses were impeccably made. They were thick and without any obvious flaws, and he could rebuild them in an instant, just like Sveen. Considering his endless reserves of mana, this meant that even Zorian would fail to break through them if he tried to gradually wear them down. He could never hope to win a battle of attrition against the ancient lich, not to mention that every second he failed to break through was a second that Quetzalcoatl could use to murder his fleshy body to remove the mental threat he posed. Thus, Zorian held nothing back when attacking the lich. He poured all of his mana into a quick succession of telepathic attacks. After 3 such attacks, he was delighted to see some actual exploitable flaws starting to appear. Quetzalcoatl was proficient enough in fixing the aftermath of a single mental attack, but multiple ones in succession strained his defenses. As powerful as he was, the ancient lich had probably not encountered a mind mage that could meaningfully threaten him for a very, very long time. His defenses had probably once been truly flawless, but since he had not had to use them in ages, he had gotten a bit rusty. Too rusty to stop Zorian, in any case. With one final push, Quetzalcoatl's mental barrier shattered into countless pieces, leaving his mind defenseless before Zorian's telepathic might. Letting loose an ear-splitting scream of incoherent rage, Quetzalcoatl swung his skeletal hand towards Zorian, firing a jagged red ray in his general direction. Zorian did not stop. Even when the ray hit him, severing his left arm just below the shoulder and sending waves of incredible pain throughout his whole body, he did not stop. He sank deeper and deeper into Quetzalcoatl's mind, paralyzing his skeletal body and starting to root through his long-term memories. Without warning, the mind Zorian was invading suddenly disappeared. The bones Quetzalcoatl had been animating fell to the ground, lifeless. The lich had admitted defeat and fled. "Ha! We did it!" yelled Zack breathlessly. "Oh man, I can't believe we actually succeeded in beating the stupid bag of bones. Oh shit. Zorian, your arm." "Why yeah, I know," Zorian said, looking at the mangled stump connected to his left shoulder. "I'm not feeling too well. I think I'm going to lie down a little." Zack was saying something, but Zorian could no longer hear him. Everything was kind of fuzzy, and eventually he just closed his eyes and let himself fall to the ground. Break. 2 hours later, Zorian had woken up from unconsciousness only to find Zack beside him and his wound professionally bandaged. It was just something he had learned while learning medical magic, Zack explained. Apparently his teachers had insisted he learn some good old-fashioned mundane care for the injuries, and lost limbs were included in these lessons. So now Zorian would get to experience what it was like to live with a missing arm for a few days. Lovely. The time loop was a gift that just kept on giving. In any case, they had to move fast. Kotachichel was bound to be utterly furious with them, and they weren't really sure how long it would take him to possess another body and come after them. They had learned that this time varied a lot from lich to lich while researching the topic, ranging from a few hours to several days. Considering how good Kotachichel was, they should probably assume it was the shorter option. After hurriedly breaking into the time magic research facility beneath Cioria, they asked Guardian of the Threshold about the crown and dagger they had newly acquired. They quickly found out that they had guessed correctly. The crown gave the controller the ability to place temporary markers on people, bringing them into the time loop for a limited time, while the dagger gave the controller an ability to place a special kind of marker on the soul of the target, letting the time loop know it should not recreate their soul in future restarts. Salkill, as Red Robe called it. Just like the orb and the ring, both items also had a mundane function that even normal people could use. The crown acted as a personal mana storage, which they already knew thanks to Kotachichel, but it was nice to have confirmation anyway. In particular, Kotachichel's story had not made it clear whether the amount of personal mana stored in the crown was proportional to the one using it or fixed. Now they knew it was fixed in size. For Kotachichel this gave him 10 times more mana reserves than he usually had, but for Zorian it would be far more since his reserves were relatively tiny in comparison. Though it would also take him forever to fully fill up the crown, as well. As for the dagger, it had the ability to cut that which cannot be cut. Or to put it more plainly, it could hurt immaterial spirits. An ability that was probably far more impressive in the distant past, when spirits were around every corner and a pissed-off god could send their servants to mess you up at any time. These days, its base ability was of dubious usefulness. Upon leaving the time magic research facility, they temporarily set the dagger aside and started feverishly tinkering with the crown, trying to figure how to activate its ability to place temporary markers while sending urgent messages to every member of their little conspiracy. Thankfully, by now they had a fair bit of experience in making Imperial artifacts work, so after a few hours they succeeded in figuring out how the crown worked. And then they got to work. By now, a whole throng of people had gathered around them. It was not just people like Alanik, Xvim, Silverlake and Damon that were there. There were also various teachers from the academy, some of whom Zorian was familiar with, Ilsa, Nora and Chiron, and some of whom he wasn't, but which Xvim assured him were dependable and could be counted on. Kerma, Tiran and several other select members of Damon's team were also there, as was his fiancée Arissa and some of the members of her house. Many Arania were also scattered about, hailing from the Silent Doorway adepts, luminous advocates, filigree sages and others that Zorian felt could be helpful and wouldn't freak out. Lukav was also here, as were some other people that Alanik had vouched for. While Zack and Zorian had been running around Blantyre, planning how to beat Kotachichel and scouting out the Salrawatham and the Ziggurat of the Sun, their fellow conspirators had been tasked with gathering all these people and informing them about the time loop. Thus, everyone here knew what they were dealing with. They did not necessarily believe in this crazy story, but that didn't really matter because seeing was believing. The restart was soon going to end, and then they would experience the truth firsthand. Zorian steeled himself a little and went out to face the crowd around them. Zorian. What the hell happened to your arm? Taven asked him with a horrified expression. It doesn't matter, he said, waving her off with his one remaining hand. I'll get it back soon, as good as new. So, said Zack happily. Who wants to be first? Chapter 086 A New World. Good morning, brother. Kirill screamed, her voice disgustedly shrill and cheerful. Morning, morning, morning. Zorian sighed, stretching his arms and legs while Kirill babbled on top of him. Another restart, another annoying wake-up call from Kirill. He gave his little sister a silent, complex look, which caused her to hesitate for a second and ask him what's wrong. Zorian didn't answer. Instead he suddenly started shaking like a madman, taking advantage of that brief moment of indecision when she loosened her grip on him to push her off to the side. She fell on the floor with a soft thud and an indignant yell. She was back on her feet in a flash, though, annoying him with questions about the academy and requests to show her some magic. In other words, she was still the same old Kirill he had come to know over the restarts. He had thought about including her among the many people who gotten a temporary marker in the previous restart, but in the end he had decided bringing her into the time loop would be reckless and cruel. Unlike the others, Kirill was just a child. Her personality had yet to fully form, and there was no telling how being stuck in a constantly repeating month would warp her thinking. She also couldn't keep a secret to save her life and had no way to really contribute to their projects. Not to mention that if he failed to find the way to extend the temporary markers before the 6th restart was up, he would have to watch her forget 6 months' worth of memories. That would be a hard pill to swallow. No, the idea was definitely off limits. While he would have appreciated a chance to have more meaningful interaction with Kirill, it wasn't worth inflicting existential dread on a 9-year-old and dragging down everyone's chances of survival just for that. After a few minutes, he finally coaxed Kirill into leaving the room. He promptly locked the door and created a single simulacrum. It was a simple ectoplasmic copy. This early in the restart, he had neither the time nor the materials to create the golem bodies necessary for the improved mechanical simulacrums he usually liked to use. However, accessibility was more important than mod efficiency in this case. He needed the simulacrum now and not later. The moment it popped into existence, the simulacrum gave him a silent nod and then teleported away. There was no need to explain anything. The simulacrum had a simple task, planned out all the way in the previous restart and now simply put into practice. His copy was to go to Seoria and immediately hunt down and dismantle our 4 cephalic rot swarms lurking in the city. It would doubtlessly alarm Quitachichel if he did that, but it had to be done. With all these new time loopers working around, the swarms were too much of a threat. They needed them gone, and the sooner it was done, the better. After dispatching the simulacrum to his task, Zorian went down into the kitchen to eat something while waiting for Ilsa to arrive. He couldn't help but be a little nervous. While Ilsa's visit at the beginning of the restart had long since become repetitive and routine, meeting his invocations teacher should be different this time around. She was, after all, one of the people they placed a temporary marker on. If everything went well, she had retained her memories of the previous restart. He shook his head, trying to collect his thoughts. He was kind of annoyed at himself for being so emotional over this. Previously, when he and Zack were considering going down this road, he had imagined himself facing this scenario with a stoic attitude and cool assurance born out of years of experiences and conflicts in the time loop. But reality was cruel and his nerves were not as steely as he imagined them to be. Would the temporary markers work as advertised? Would they work at all? Would Ilsa be able to take first-hand experience of the time loop in good grace, or would she flip out and start flinging spells at him, demanding answers? He couldn't help but worry about questions such as this as minutes ticked by. What was taking her so long, anyway? He wasn't sure, but he thought it didn't usually take this much time before she... There was a knock at the door. "I'll get it," said Zorian quickly, rushing for the door. Mother looked amused at this kind of reaction, but said nothing as he ran past her. He opened the door and found Ilsa standing there. She looked no different than she usually did at the beginning of the restart. The same clothes, the same judging look, the same stack of documents held in her hands. However, that was only outward appearance. To his empathic senses, she was practically radiating uncertainty and apprehension. They stared at each other in silence for a while. "May I come in?" Ilsa eventually asked. "Oh," said Zorian with a small laugh, wincing inwardly at his behavior. "I guess I spaced out a little. Forgive my manners, Miss Zalti. Come in, please? Thank you, Mr. Kaczynski, she said, stepping into the house. Although his momentary brain freeze wasn't the most flattering way to start a meeting like this, it seemed to have put Ilsa at ease somewhat, as he felt a lot of the tension drain out of her in the aftermath. Like usual, Mother immediately left the house when she realized who had come, taking Kirill with her. This left Zorian alone with Ilsa to ostensibly discuss his electives and whatnot. But, well, same as the last time, I suppose? Ilsa asked, waving the academy documents in front of her. When Zorian answered yes, she simply threw the stack to the side and sighed. Of course. You probably heard this all 100 times by now. I don't even know why I brought these along with me. Clinging to a sense of normalcy in light of a very bizarre situation, Zorian guessed. I was the same, back when I was first dragged into the time loop. I spent quite a few loops going through the motions. You were a teenager who barely started learning magic, though. I am an experienced adult mage. I should be better than this, Ilsa countered, frowning slightly. She was silent for a few seconds, tapping her fingers against the table as she considered what to say next. So this is real? We really travel back in time? It's a little more complex than that, but yes, Zorian said. He didn't want to get bogged down in details of how the time loop actually worked. Did the marker we gave you work? Obviously, she scoffed. How would we be having this conversation otherwise? What I meant was, did you completely retain your magic and memories? Zorian clarified. Any holes in your recollection or difficulty in doing magic? That's a possibility? She asked, surprised. It might be. As I said in the previous restart, this is the first time we have done something like this, Zorian said. She gave it a thought for a minute before shaking her head. I don't feel there are any obvious blanks in my memories, she said. I did forget quite a few things, but I think that's just me being forgetful as usual. My memory is hardly flawless. As for magic, well, I'm a grown mage that has reached most of her potential years ago, and a month is not that long of a time. Plus, it wasn't like I did any real training sessions in the span of this month. In other words, any growth in shaping skills you may have experienced is so minuscule that you wouldn't even notice if it was gone, Zorian surmised. Yes, that, Ilsa nodded. I guess I can learn a new spell or two this time just to see if I retain them the next time the world resets. I can probably just ask Kale. The effect of even 1 month on his shaping skills and spell knowledge should be dramatic enough to tell, pointed out Zorian. I suppose that's true, said Ilsa. Plus, now that I think about it, I'm probably going to improve my shaping skills and learn quite a few new spells just by helping you out over time. Though you never did really explain what you wanted our help with. Yes, we did not explain our plans and reasons too deeply in the previous restart, admitted Zorian. Partly because we didn't want to overwhelm people with information, but also because we suspected you would only take us seriously after you witnessed the time loop with your own 2 eyes. Ha! Well, you're probably right about that, Ilsa laughed. Xveen tried to explain how the time loop worked when he was trying to convince me to accept a mysterious soul marker from my 2 teenage students. I confess I didn't pay too much attention to it, since the whole idea was so crazy. I'd have probably been even less interested in what you and Zach had to say. Well, at least she was honest. Do you want me to explain now? Zorian asked. No, she said immediately. I don't think I could pay attention well enough at the moment. I'm still rather disturbed at reliving the same month all over again. You said this has been happening for a while now? Yes. The time loop has repeated itself many times, Zorian said. This is just your first time remembering it. So, before this I was just obliviously reliving the same month over and over again? Repeated the jobs, taught the same classes and spoke the same conversations? Well, sometimes me and Zach shook things up a bit and you reacted accordingly, reacting to the changes, Zorian said. But yes. Without a marker, people do not retain continuity across restarts. I tried to talk to some of the people around me before coming here, Ilsa admitted. Just to check if they really don't remember anything. I couldn't resist. I don't think I revealed anything crucial, but I feel it's only fair to let you know. Zorian sighed. He suspected she wasn't the only one to make such discreet tests, and that there would be more of that stuff to deal with later. But that was okay. They kind of expected that. I understand the need for confirmation, but please try to be responsible about this, he said. It would be a disaster if the knowledge of the time loop reached certain people. And now I'm being lectured by one of my teenage students, Ilsa said, clacking her tongue. How low the mighty have fallen. But fair enough, I do understand we have a mighty, millennia-old lich breathing down our necks. Your fight against him has left quite an impression on me, I must say. Zorian just made a slightly sour expression in response. Unsurprisingly, Kotachichil had taken great offense at them trying to look through his memories and stealing his crown. While Zack and Zorian were placing temporary markers on people, Kotachichil was burning down the Nevada estate and Imayu's house as the first step of his revenge. Fortunately, all inhabitants of Imayu's place had been evacuated to Koth by that point, and Zack couldn't care less about the Nevada estate. The ancient lich remained quiet after that, probably because he couldn't find them and still had an invasion to execute. Then Zack and Zorian had the bright idea to bring the new loopers to Seoria on invasion day, to show them how high the stakes really were. Despite being under a plethora of powerful divination wards and constantly moving, Kotachichil somehow noticed them. The resulting fight completely leveled the street they were fighting in. Though Kotachichil is a huge danger, I'm pretty sure the Eldemarian government, the Triumvirate Church, powerful noble houses and other powers would also make problems for us if they knew, Zorian said. So please be careful. They spent the next half an hour discussing various things, the mechanics of the time loop, the way things usually developed if Zack and Zorian did not interfere with things, and the details behind the Ebisan invasion. Ilsa turned out to be just as interested in the invasion of Seoria as she was in the time loop itself. Then again, that was probably not too unusual. They brought people to witness the attack for a reason. You don't seem to care much for the suffering and devastation we witnessed, Ilsa eventually said, a note of condemnation in her voice. I'm just a little numb to it all, that's all. I've seen it happen too many times, sometimes from the memories of the invaders themselves, Zorian said. It's impossible for me to have the same visceral reaction to it that you probably have. You read their memories? She asked, surprised. I had to, he simply said. Of course you've dabbled in mind magic too, she said in a strange tone. Dabbled? Zorian huffed. This annoys me more than it probably should. I did not dabble in it, I'm a natural mind mage who spent years honing his skills. She seemed to be at a loss for words upon hearing that. This situation is endlessly bizarre and disturbing, she finally said after a few seconds. Agreed, Zorian nodded. I've been stuck in this time loop for nearly 8 years, not counting all the time dilation chambers, and I still think that. Time dilation chambers? Ilsa asked. She suddenly shook her head. No, never mind that for now. 8 years is actually not as long as I thought it would be. I got included rather late into this thing, Zorian said. Zack is the one who has spent decades inside a time loop. Ugh. Every answer gives me 5 new questions, Ilsa complained. You know what? Let's stop this for now. You were planning to take the train to Seoria, right? Yes, I'm taking Kariel with me, so I need to pretend I'm somewhat normal. Of course, if you are willing to teleport us to Seoria yourself. No, she said immediately. I'm taking a train ride with you instead. Zorian was taken aback at the proclamation. He knew that things would be very much different now that other loopers were working around, but he couldn't help but get blindsided by things like this. Why? Zorian asked uncertainly. You might be used to it, but I've just watched the city get brutally invaded by hordes of monsters and undead, she told him. I'd like to stay away from Seoria for a while, and this is a convenient excuse. Oh, he said lamely. Come to think of it, It had only been a few hours at most since the invasion, at least from her perspective. "You don't mind, do you?" she asked him. "Not at all," he said, shaking his head. "Just watch out for Kirill if you plan to ride in the same compartment as us. She has an intense interest in magic and anything related to it, and she's probably going to find you absolutely fascinating." "I don't see a problem with that," Ilsa smiled. "It's nice to see kids interested in my work." Zorian didn't bother to clarify things. Some things were better as a surprise. Break. Mother did not look very surprised when Ilsa informed her she would be accompanying them to the train station. It probably seemed entirely sensible to her that Ilsa would use a train to get back to Seoria. The two of them got along pretty well with one another, and were soon happily chatting along as they waited on the station for the train to arrive. Zorian mostly ignored the conversation, as it sounded like your typical parent-teacher discussion. Kirill was too excited about going to Seoria to care about the teacher that had decided to stick around for a while longer, but Fatov did feel the need to approach the group and say hi after seeing Ilsa present. That was a little new. "You didn't include Fatov among those who received the marker," Ilsa observed quietly. "No," Zorian whispered back. "He's useless and I don't like him." Ilsa had nothing to say in response to that, just giving him a guarded look in return. Maybe he really was a little harsh towards Fatov. Still, he honestly couldn't see any good reason to give the guy a temporary marker. Fatov was unreliable and had no work ethic, so including him in the time loop would be about as wise as including Kirill. Eventually they boarded the train and set off towards Seoria. Kirill became more wary of Ilsa when she realized the teacher was going to stay in the same compartment as them, but, well, it was Kirill. Patience was never her strong suit. She barely lasted half an hour before she started bombarding Ilsa with questions. Ilsa was a patient woman, but after an hour and a half of Kirill's chattiness, Zorian could feel she was starting to get rather exasperated with the whole situation. Thus, he decided to have mercy on her and distracted his little sister with a bunch of visually impressive illusions and stories. Ilsa observed the illusionary scenes he conjured up with a surprising amount of interest. Try as he might, he just couldn't figure out what she found so fascinating about those. Weren't they just illusions? She was a mage at the continent's best magical academy. Surely she had seen plenty of those in her life. Eventually he decided to ask her. Since he didn't want Kirill to listen in on them, he established a mental link to her and spoke to her telepathically. She was badly startled at first, flinching at the sudden voice in her head, but she recovered quickly. Her response was swift and smooth, with no unintentional thoughts leaking through. It was clear that she had experience with this kind of communication. "You can ignore the shaping disruption of the train wars," Ilsa telepathically sent back through the link. "I mean, of course you can. For someone like you, doing that is a minor thing. I could do it too. However, casting such sophisticated illusions while being suppressed by the wards, that takes considerable skill. Did you say you were trying to pretend you are somewhat normal? How is this even remotely normal? Well, it's not like Kirill can really tell how amazing this is," he sent back lamely. Truthfully, neither could he until this point. He learned these illusions pretty much solely to entertain Kirill. They were just little tricks to him, and so was the ability to bypass the laughable disruption wards on the train. It completely slipped his mind that someone like Ilsa could figure out exactly what he was doing and how difficult it was and find it notable. "So," Ilsa said, "you are good enough at combat magic to fight a 1,000-year-old lich. You are a mind mage and an illusionist. You can teleport around with ease and open dimensional gates. You can create duplicates of yourself. You are an expert golem maker, with all that implies. You say you achieved all of that in, what, 8 years? Pretty much, yeah," Zorian confirmed. "Forgive me for being blunt here, Mr. Kaczynski, but aren't you a fairly average mage?" Ilsa asked curiously. "I never got an impression that you are some amazingly talented person from the information I was given. And trust me, people had looked into it. Whenever a world-class talent like Damon appears, their family is always investigated in case their boons run in the blood. Aside from being an innate mind mage, I am indeed pretty average, Zorian said calmly. Ilsa's comment might have infuriated him once, but these days he no longer cared. I know what you're thinking, and yes, my rapid growth as a mage is all due to the time loop. It doesn't just give time, you know. It's also given me nigh limitless resources, access to restricted materials and plenty of normally unobtainable experience. It's also put me under enormous pressure, keeping me constantly motivated in a way I otherwise wouldn't be. I honestly think anyone could do what I did, if put in the same position. Well, provided they didn't just break under the pressure. Ilsa stayed quiet for a while, but Zorian could practically feel the gears turning in her head. She was probably realizing for the first time the sort of amazing opportunity the time loop represented. I think I'm getting just a tiny bit jealous of you, Mr. Kaczynski, Ilsa eventually concluded. Don't envy me just yet, he told her. There is still a good chance that I will get erased in the end, and everything I have worked for will be for naught. What? She asked, startled. What do you mean? With that, he started explaining the situation in detail to her. He told her about Red Robe, the uncertainty about whether they could even get out of the time loop, the problems he had to solve to survive the exit, and so on. It took a while to go through everything. Strangely enough, Ilsa looked calmer and more reassured by the end, even though he had just told her there was a big chance they would all lose everything at the end. Then again, maybe it wasn't so strange. She already knew that temporary markers like her own only lasted 6 months. Compared to that, a more distant deadline that would also destroy Zack and Zorian probably didn't seem so intimidating. On the contrary, she may have found it reassuring that they also had the same fate waiting for them, if they failed. I was wondering why you decided to include so many people in this time loop, instead of just monopolizing the whole thing for yourself and Zack. Your situation is quite desperate, she said, humming to herself audibly enough for Kirill to hear her and give her funny looks. You don't have to sound so happy about it, Zorian groused. But yes, we really do need your help badly. Ilsa was mostly included because of her connections. Though she acted a bit low-key most of the time, she knew many people and was owed quite a few favors. Hopefully, she could help them convince people to go along with whatever crazy plans they came up with and smooth any ruffled feathers they caused along the way. Considering how few other members of their little conspiracy were diplomatically inclined or familiar with bureaucratic wrangling, this was a valuable skill. Plus, she was a powerful alteration expert. Zorian wasn't sure, but he felt she might be able to help him produce his golems faster. She couldn't animate them, of course, but he was currently producing such a large number of them every restart that it took a while to simply create enough mechanical bodies for animation. If Ilsa was as good at alteration and material alchemy as Xveen claimed, she should be able to take over that part of the production process and free Zorian to do other things. Why not just hire someone to do that for you? Ilsa asked when he told her that. I hear from Xveen you've been doing that a lot already. I can't, Zorian shook his head. Anyone I contract will surely figure out what I intend to do with such a sophisticated metal doll, and making combat-capable golems is forbidden without a license. Makes sense, Ilsa said. You don't want to have random mages building themselves a private army of golems in their free time. Exactly, Zorian said. I might be able to coax a person to build me a single puppet, but if I order a batch of 20 puppets, they'll freak out. Nobody wants to get implicated in an attempted rebellion or whatever. I'd be lucky if they didn't immediately report me to the government when they throw me out of the shop. Ilsa nodded. After some thought, she changed the subject. You know, all this talk about golems and alteration is reminding me of something I thought of when you were explaining how the time loop works. Destroying the entire world and then recreating it out of nothing. It reminds me of a persistent ambition of mine. Oh, you mean true creation? Zorian guessed. You know about it? Ilsa was surprised. I don't remember talking about it around you. I suppose one of my previous incarnations told you about it? Yeah, Zorian confirmed. I sought you out quite often in the beginning to learn from you. You taught me much of what I know right now, or at least gave me a push in the right direction. We'll have to talk about that more on some other occasion, Ilsa said with a smile. It looks like you owe me and I don't even know about it. How am I supposed to know to seek you out for favors if I don't even know that I have leverage over you? But anyway, true creation. Yes, in a way, the time loop is the ultimate expression of that desire of mine. A magic that creates an entire world, over and over again. Are you sure you have no idea how it is done? No, sorry, Zorian said apologetically. That power is absolutely godlike in scope and mystery. Or rather, primordial, since the Sovereign Gate seems to be made out of one of those. Considering the stories of mortal mages doing it in the past, and in light of the fact that there is a device that can repeatedly create an entire world, I am convinced it is easier than most people suspect. Maybe I'll be able to figure something out by observing this constantly recreated world I'm in, Ilsa said wistfully. Maybe, Zorian said doubtfully. He doubted she would really get anywhere with that, but he wouldn't stop her. Eventually, Kirill dozed off and the telepathic conversation died down a little, leaving both Zorian and Ilsa lost in their own thoughts. The train continued its routine journey to Sioria. Break. When Zorian, Kirill and Ilsa arrived in Sioria and disembarked, they found there were people already waiting for them. Zack being there was kind of expected, but he was also accompanied by Xvim, Chiron and Taven. Most people did not react to this, of course, but Kirill knew damn well that there was something fishy about that and kept giving everyone weird glances and got really quiet for a time. Zorian also noticed Vertov staring at him weirdly in the distance. He wasn't sure how much his brother really knew about him, but he was probably aware that Zorian hadn't had any real friends until recently, so having a bunch of people wait for him at the train station was beyond unusual. He did not make any move or approach, though, since nobody was attacking anyone and Zorian didn't look like he needed help. After dropping off Kirill at Imayu's place, the group found a secluded location and started talking. Chiron, their combat magic instructor, was included into the group due to his high combat skills and the fact he had connections to people in Aldamar's military. He was the first to speak up. These temporary markers you placed on us to retain our memories. Can they be revoked? Chiron asked. Of course the first thing they wanted to discuss was the markers. Zorian didn't blame them. He knew he would have been the same if he were in their place. He was kind of mystified why they hadn't just asked Zack about that while they were waiting instead of saving it until now, but maybe they had talked about other things, such as how the time loop worked. Or maybe they had just gathered together quite recently and hadn't had the time to discuss anything. He knew that Zack hated waiting and had a habit of showing up late, so he probably hadn't been at the train station for long. Yes, Zorian told him bluntly. At will. Chiron asked next. Well, we need the crown that is currently in Quatachichel's possession to do it, Zorian said carefully. So not really, no. Also, removing the marker only prevents you from keeping your magic and memories when the world resets next, Zack said. It doesn't wipe away what you achieved until that point. Can the marker be reapplied once it runs out or is revoked? Xvim asked. I know what you're thinking, Zack sighed. Sadly, it's not that easy. Yes, you can place a marker on the same person the second time, but only after 12 restarts have passed. You can't just remove the marker and then reapply it to extend the time. I imagined it was something like that, Xvim admitted. Zorian suddenly yelped in pain. After looking around, he realized Taven had pinched his arm for no discernible reason. Why did you do that? He protested. I wanted to make sure your arm is really fine, she said, frowning. Zorian suddenly realized this was the same arm that ended up getting cut off by Quatachichel in the previous restart. He had pretty much been a cripple the last time that she had seen him. Still, how the hell was it okay for her to just pinch him like that? Huffing with indignation, Zorian stepped away from Taven and maneuvered himself to place Ilsa between the two of them. Ilsa gave him an amused look in response. So what's the plan? Chiron said. We are hoping we can figure out a way to adjust the temporary markers into lasting indefinitely, Zorian said. Admittedly, Tampering with a piece of magic that probably had gods involved in its construction sounds hopeless. But we suspect that Red Robe entered the time loop through this very method. If so, it should be possible for us to do it as well. Right? If Red Robe could have done it, surely all of us working together should be able to work something up, Zack said. And if you fail? Xvim insisted. We will hopefully gather the entire key before all 6 restarts run out, at which point we will be able to unblock the exit, Zorian said. If we have an exit method also ready by then, we might be able to just get you out of the time loop at that point. At which point it doesn't really matter that your marker will run out. And what, you're just going to continue in the time loop alone afterwards? Taven asked. Or are you just going to create new temporary loopers once we're gone? And then get them out too? I don't know about the rest, but I think the world doesn't need 3 different Tavens. Actually, we would just exit the time loop with you, Zack said. We already got almost everything we could wish for out of the time loop. No need to risk everything by being greedy and cutting things close. If we can leave 6 months from now, we will. Silence greeted this proclamation. Zorian knew that the new loopers were worried about their motives, afraid that he and Zack were trying to make use of them as much as possible before discarding them. Not an unreasonable fear. Temporary markers were pretty much designed with that in mind. Presumably the controller would place these on people without ever informing them of the time limit, allowing them to reap all the benefits of having a person work with them for 6 months and then conveniently forgetting everything. However, Zack and Zorian did not intend to use the temporary markers just to get a convenient workforce. They got them into the mess and they would do their best to get them out of it. Maybe they would fail in the end, but it wouldn't be for the lack of trying. Well, Xvim eventually said, breaking the silence. We'd best get to work, then. Days passed, and the effects of the many new loopers rapidly became evident. Kale arrived in Seoria earlier, barely a day after Zorian did. Lukaven Alanik did not need to be saved from Sadamir's machinations. Taven no longer bothered hunting monsters with her team. Ilsa's classes were completely different, since she decided she would shake things up a bit. The cephalic rats had been completely wiped out by Zorian's simulacrum on the very first day of the restart, with the exception of a handful of individuals the simulacrum had saved up for study. Their usual routine of convincing Xvim, Alanik and Silverlake that the time loop was real became unnecessary, freeing up a surprisingly substantial amount of time. Finally, not having to gain the trust of the silent doorway adepts before they could use their ability to operate the Bakura Gate network meant they could access distant places from the very start of the restart. Thus, once Zack and Zorian had sorted out the situation in Seoria for a bit, they used the Bakura Gate to reach Koth so they could pick up the Imperial Orb. And maybe get themselves a pet Hydra. Before they did that, though, they decided to visit the Tarhamatula estate to see if everything was fine there. Damon had assured them that the people he had picked were reliable, but Zorian knew better than anyone that Damon said a lot of things. When they arrived, they found the whole estate to be a hive of activity, people constantly coming and going, and there were people already waiting for them. There was no need to justify themselves or try to get them to admit Damon was present, like they usually did the first time they contacted them in the restart. Still, while not having to wait at the door was convenient, what came later was not. Just like the new loopers back in Seoria, the new loopers in Koth also wanted their questions answered, and what was supposed to be just a short checkup ended up being a grueling question-and-answer session that lasted for most of the day. I really hope this is a one-time thing, Zorian groused later to Damon. You were supposed to explain these sort of things to them, Damon. I did. Damon protested. They just wanted to hear things from you, I guess. Can you blame them? I guess not, Zorian said. If Damon had explained things fairly, then these people must surely know it wasn't Damon who was really in charge. It made sense that they wanted to talk to the people who are the source of the temporary markers and have first-hand information. Anyway, did you get your team ready? Will the Tarhamatula really cooperate when you inform them you want to send their best trackers all the way to Blantyre all of a sudden? This was the main reason he and Zack wanted Damon's cooperation, and why they allowed him to include so many people into the marked group. To put it bluntly, they needed these people to find the staff. They had managed to track down a Bakura gate on Blantyre in the previous restart, thanks to the help from that Lizardman King, but that was just the first step. The next was to track down a tiny little staff on a giant, jungle-covered continent. To put it bluntly, this was something that he and Zack alone were utterly incapable of doing. Zorian would never say this out loud to Damon, but he and his group were probably the most critical people to receive the temporary markers. Without them, they would probably never find the staff. This was one of the primary reasons they decided to go down this path to begin with. My team will listen to me, even if I tell them we're going to Blantyre through a dimensional gate opened up by my little brother, Damon said proudly. Hell, they'd probably go along with it even if I alone received the marker, but they would complain more. With Tarun, Kerma and other critical members of the team also on board, though, everyone will readily fall in line. As for the Tarhamatula, well, I'm not sure what level of support we can get out of them, but we will definitely get something. The main problem is that we're being a bit unreasonable and pushing for full commitment to this project without the idea being even hinted at before now. That's not how House Tarhamatula usually does things, to say the least, so some tension and incredulity are to be expected. Will it help if I give you money and resources to throw at them? Zorian asked. I know House Tarhamatula is not poor, but I'm pretty sure me and Zack could gather enough money to finance a small state if we really try. Not to mention a large amount of priceless materials that cannot be bought on the open market. Damon looked at him with a strange mixture of horror and joy, his face alternating between various unusual grimaces. I hate you, he finally said. You better plan to gift some of that money to your poor older brother when we get out. Aren't you pretty well off? Zorian asked, arching his eyebrow at him. You're even marrying into nobility. You can never have enough money, Damon said. Never. And yes, please do send all that money here if you can. Trying to flat-out bribe the Tarhamatula directly with it wouldn't go well, but I'm sure they would look more favorably on the plan if we agreed to pay for all the equipment and mercenaries out of our own pockets. And some completely unrelated gifts would probably be appreciated. Zorian nodded and made a mental note to mention the matter to Zack. And speaking of Zack, his fellow time traveler. Well, one of his fellow time travelers, now, was already waiting for them at the front gate, humming to himself happily. Zorian didn't have to ask to know what the other boy was thinking of at the moment. Say, Zorian asked Damon. Do you know what the legality of owning a giant, magically enhanced Hydra is in Eldamar? Just asking for a friend.